what I wanted to do was to come up with some general principles to give all of you that hopefully you'll be able to pull from and apply to whatever specific audience you think you might have, with whatever specific goal you have in your writing, and hopefully that will work for you. I also noticed a lot of you taking notes, which is a good thing. And I'm glad I numbered my presentation in a way. I think my presentation will be conducive to note-taking, so if you're that type of person, I think it'll be good for you. As Matt mentioned, I've been writing for Christ in Pop Culture for the last 2 years. As a film columnist, I was writing once a week. I've slowed down a little bit recently. So I'm going to be drawing from that experience primarily because that's the writers community that I've been most a part of, and it's the website that I've spent the most time writing for. So in terms of note-taking, I have 5 main points I want to touch on quickly because we don't have a lot of time. But the first is I want to talk about why knowing your audience is important. Then I want to talk about keys to knowing your audience effectively. I want to talk about writing for a Christian audience as a Christian. I want to talk about writing for a secular audience as a Christian. And then I'll close with how I think those last 2 things, writing for a Christian audience and a secular audience, actually intersect in ways you might not expect. So first, why knowing your audience is important. I have 3 reasons. First, your approach to a given topic, or the topic altogether, will be different depending on who your audience is. That's because different audiences have different needs. So in my column on movies, I'm writing for Christ in Pop Culture, which is a Christian website. I have some baseline questions I have to ask myself on a week-to-week basis. Am I writing for an audience who has seen the movie? Am I writing for an audience who is trying to decide if they want to see the movie? Am I writing for an audience with special critical knowledge about film? Am I writing for a general audience who likes to go to the movies every now and then? The answer to any of those sets of questions will dictate how the article will go, how the column will go. And it will be different depending on which of those audiences I'm writing for. So related to that then, you can kind of see where I'm going with the second reason. The second reason why knowing your audience is important is knowing your audience allows you to focus your writing in a way that makes it far more effective. That's because you're giving yourself a more specific purpose. The more specific your purpose, the more particular your purpose, the more insightful your writing is likely to be, the more refined it's likely to be. And then thirdly, striving to know your audience, and this is sort of most of us I think are Christians here, right? Striving to know your audience is qualitative of loving your neighbor, okay? So if you go to write something for a particular audience, especially if you want to write something where you disagree with that audience, you better know what they actually think and represent it well. So you're seeking understanding as generously as you can by imaginatively immersing yourself in his or her situation. I'm talking about your audience. Know their situation and do so generously. We should do that as Christians, but a lot of people publishing right now aren't doing that, I can tell you. Now, second point, keys to knowing your audience effectively. 5 keys. First is a basic one. Know what they believe and what's important to them. Okay, that's kind of 2 ways of saying the same thing, but know what they believe and know what's important to them. But you don't want to stop there, okay? You should also know why they think they believe what they believe or why they think something is important to them. Okay, so you want to try to understand why they think something is important or why they believe what they believe. Part of this is they may agree with you, but they may not have good reasons for why they think what you think. Right? And so you might want to help them with their reasons for thinking or believing what they do. Thirdly, though, you want to consider the cultural conditions which might have led them to their beliefs. Okay? So that's part of knowing why they believe what they believe in a way that they might not even know. So you want to have a long view of how an audience came to believe what they believe. And sometimes that audience doesn't have that. I think we've all been there. I know that I've been really short-sighted in my beliefs at different times in my life. I didn't know that I was part of a particular culture that led me to believe what I believe. So our beliefs are culturally conditioned. If you want to know your audience well, don't just know what they believe. Don't just know why they think they believe it. Know the cultural conditions that led them to believe it. Fourth key, that was my third, I think, for those taking notes. Fourth thing, and I think this is really important, be part of a diverse, challenging writers community. Okay? Christ in Pop Culture is wonderful with this. We have a private writers group on Facebook that we frequent probably too much. But let me tell you something. Behind the scenes, we have candid, challenging, sometimes heated conversation that happens before a really important article ever gets published. So especially an article that we know is going to be really controversial, it goes through the fire behind the scenes before it's ever published. And that's really important. I know there's a couple times where I had an article in mind and I'm really glad got scrapped before it was published. And so that happened through a community. Don't try and know your audience on your own. You won't know your audience on your own well. You need to be part of a writer's community. It will save you a lot of trouble, I promise you. Not only that, though, it'll shape your perspective in productive ways. You can't possibly have a perspective for multiple audiences that hasn't been shaped by other perspectives. Christ Pop Culture is really good with this. You know, some people might think we're a little bit of a mushy middle because we do reach a broad audience, left, right, Christian, not Christian. But we come from an evangelical perspective, but we do have variation. You know, some people in our writers group lean a little left, some people lean a little right in their beliefs. And so it's a really productive community in that way. Okay, last reason, how to know your audience effectively. And this is the most important, I think, the one I'm ending on here. Know what may be a weakness for your audience. Consider what you believe your audience needs to hear, not primarily what they would enjoy hearing. And this flies in the face of modern media, particularly social media. I love social media. I think it's a great tool. But you need to be careful. It does incentivize you saying what your audience wants to hear rather than what they need to hear. And so be careful that you're not preaching to the choir, is basically what I'm saying. As a Christian, our economy of vocation is not to develop our audience for ourselves, okay? Our economy of vocation is that we ought to look beyond personal incentives. And so what that means is you should not be afraid to say what you know your audience needs to hear out of fear of losing social media followers. So let me be clear, and I want to make this really clear. The number of social media followers or the extent of one's readership might be indicative of the reach of one's influence, but it is not at all indicative of the quality of one's influence. So take note. Thirdly, writing for a Christian audience. That's my next main point. Writing for a Christian audience. 4 considerations. Writing as a Christian for a Christian audience. First thing, encourage your readership with a sense of gospel joy and contentment. Okay? So what I mean by that is you have an even keel that doesn't descend into manipulation, fear-mongering, alarmism. Avoid all of those things, though they're very attractive for more readership. Very attractive. So you should, honestly, this is a serious thing. You should be disturbed by the extent to which certain hateful, fear-inducing organizations have control over many Christians' hearts. My colleague, Alan Noble at Christ in Pop Culture, he had a column until he had to write a dissertation. He had a column called Citizenship Confusion. And what he did on a weekly basis was alert Christians to where they were confusing their earthly citizenship with their kingdom citizenship in heaven. And he spends most of his free time, I think he's crazy sometimes, he spends most of his free time alerting Christians to websites that are profiting off of lies meant to manipulate ideological fears. Okay? That's a widespread thing. You would be amazed at some of the websites and some of the followers they have. For the Christian, though, writing for a Christian audience, in this life it's never as glorious as it's going to be, and it's never as bad as it could be, because our faith is one that's qualitatively hopeful. Second consideration. Be willing to be self-critical if you're identifying as a Christian and writing for a Christian audience. I mean that of yourself personally, and I mean that of Christians generally. Look, as Bible-believing Christians, we think we mess things up a lot, right? And so I want to be careful with this. I think there's a different set of ethical implications for addressing someone personally, someone out there that you don't know. A lot of flame throwing that happens online. But in terms of being self-critical of Christians in the culture, generally speaking, I think that's something that you should do. So we need to call out when Christians have got it wrong or when they've misrepresented God. Unbelievers are watching the conversation we're having with each other. And they will know us by our self-correcting capacity, if you wanted to put it that way. So, third consideration for Christians. This is related to the second one. We need to criticize. We tend to think criticism is this bad thing, but there is constructive criticism, and we need to criticize in an uplifting manner. Okay? So people can read through whether or not you actually care about them when you're criticizing them. So do you actually care about the person you're criticizing? If you don't criticize them. So another thing you could do to be constructive, though, is don't just tell them that they're wrong. Try to teach in what you're saying. Try to share what you think you know that would enable them to learn something. And don't be condescending about that. You don't have to be. And so my last one, then, my fourth consideration for writing for a Christian audience, is introduce them to writers or thinkers who have been influential in your life. This is a big one for me. I think one of the most pivotal moments in my life was when a friend who was a graduate of Liberty University, he did a very simple thing, but it was life-changing. He recommended books to me. He recommended authors to me. In fact, 2 of the 3 that I'm going to mention in a moment were recommendations that he gave me. And they've shaped me personally. They've shaped me professionally. And so this is a thing of humility, too. Don't act like what you're presenting to your audience you've come to on your own, right? Share your sources for growth with other people. They could benefit from those sources too. So every person has what he or she considers to be a reliable voice in his or her life, a voice that's been influential. We make choices about who we deem trustworthy. As an author, as an influence, connect your Christian audience with trustworthy voices. In my column, The Moviegoer, I do this a lot. A lot of film critics don't really do this, but I tend to link to other writers, other film columnists, Christian or otherwise, who I think are really insightful, who I read regularly. And even if they disagree with my overall point, I'll link to them if I think they're being insightful, and I think my audience would benefit from reading them. So that would be my last consideration for writing for a Christian audience. My next section is writing for a secular audience. We throw that word around a lot, secular, but to write for a secular audience, you need to understand the secularist position, and that's not an easy thing to do. Certainly not something I can do in the next 10 minutes. But to be a secularist commonly means, if you just look up a basic definition, that you have a deep distrust or skepticism of religious belief. Okay? Or the secularist thinks that the supposed neutrality of reason provides the resources for liberty, equality, and fraternity better than, say, Christianity, right? So, in other words, the secularist is interested in the observable and the reasonable according to his or her definition of those things, and they are not interested in arguments from divine revelation. They're not going to be persuaded by you quoting chapter and verse from the Bible. So, maybe some would, but not many. Okay, if they're really a secularist and you're trying to argue something in the public sphere. So how do we create open roads for conversation with this audience? And how do we become participants in that conversation? It's a small book, but I highly recommend it. A Rumor of Angels by Peter Berger. He's a well-known sociologist, Lutheran, a little liberal, nothing we need to be afraid of. So Peter Berger, in this book, A Rumor of Angels, really influential on my thinking and my approach to a secular audience. Okay? And I want to read something he has here where he gives us a little bit of insight about where I want to go in terms of how to approach a secular audience. he says, as a possible theological starting point, you want to consider this: the starting point of anthropology, using the term in the continental sense as referring to the philosophical enterprise that concerns itself with this question: what is man? What does it mean to be a human being, basically? If the religious projections of man correspond to a reality that is superhuman and supernatural, then it seems logical to look for traces of this reality in the projector himself. This is not to suggest an empirical theology, but rather a theology of very high empirical sensitivity that seeks to correlate its propositions with what can be empirically known. To the extent that its starting point is anthropological, such a theology will return to some of the fundamental concerns of Protestant liberalism. Without, it is to be hoped, the latter's deference to the culture despisers of religion and their assorted triumphalisms. So what's he saying there? What he's saying is, as Christians, speaking to a secular audience, you need to have a fully formed understanding of how what we believe coming from divine revelation connects with what it means to be human on a day-to-day basis in our lived existence. Okay? So this isn't Protestant liberalism in the sense that we're not starting from anthropology to create a theology. Most of us, I think, start from the revelation of God as our source of knowledge and theology. But some of us have kind of stopped there with abstract theological concepts up here that aren't grounded in day-to-day life, existence, what it means to be a human being. So I think you need to talk on those terms with a secular audience, because they're not going to be open to the abstract theological concepts, at least not right away. So you need to have a fully formed understanding of how theology informs anthropology, or what it means to be human. I'm meaning that in the philosophical sense. And so you want to do so in such a way that you can write about life as it is in the same way that secularists might, but you do so from the sort of reason which is enlightened by revelation. Okay, so you are speaking on secularist terms, kind of coming down on their level, but saying, well, how do you make sense of this reality? Can you make sense of it from just reason divorced from any revelation? And so you want to kind of have those sorts of conversations. Peter Berger also has, and this is my second point for writing for a secular audience, it's related to this. He has what he calls signals of transcendence, signs that there is more to life than meets the eye, so to speak. I'll give you a few of what he says. He says the human propensity for order, the fact that we order our lives, we order our cultures, we order our societies. We tend to, if you understand evil as chaos, that's a powerful argument, okay? Second one is play. Just human, that we love to play. The goal of play is usually joy. And in those moments, he says, when you are experiencing great joy in your play, whatever that is for you, he says that in that moment, it brackets the reality of our situation, of the fact that we're living to death. In other words, he says that in that moment, it's almost like an enclave for eternity. That's really, really powerful. Third one is hope, the fact that human beings tend to hope. It's a human thing to do. We don't place our hope in the same objects, but we all do hope. We're oriented toward the future. Hope is what allows us to overcome difficulties and sufferings in the moment. And so hope is another signal of transcendence, he points out. Another is our deep propensity to deny death's existence, or to say no to death. Psychologically and morally, not many of us tend to think of the fact that we could die at any time, because it's really too hard to bear. And we tend to just sort of push it out of the way psychologically. But even worse than that, when a loved one dies, it's very human to think, no matter what your faith or non-faith, you'll see him again. It's not the very end. There's not a finality to death. Death doesn't have triumph. That's a human thing to do. Fifth, our deeply felt sense of justice and injustice is a signal of transcendence. And then lastly, humor. The fact that we laugh at man's imprisonment in the world, our finitude, this comic thing that comes from the sensibility that our many felt incongruities with the way things ought to be will one day be overcome. Okay, so that was kind of a long point, but no signals of transcendence. No things that would undermine people's plausibility structures. Okay? Thirdly, know the commonly held and valued cultural beliefs. Okay? So in our culture, I'll tell you 3 things, and there's more, but 3 things you ought to know how to deal with. Our culture really values freedom. So do you have something to say, this is what it means to be free, that's coming from a Christian perspective? Our culture really values authenticity. Are you able to articulate what it means to be authentically human? And our culture values self-awareness. Do you know what it means to truly be self-aware? If you can speak to issues like those in our culture, it's really powerful because we really value those things. And we have really messed up definitions of what they mean. Fourthly, know the culture's defeater beliefs. I'm borrowing from Tim Keller, who I think borrowed from Alvin Plantinga. Okay, so props to Alvin Plantinga. He's a philosopher at Notre Dame, I think. But Tim Keller, pastor in New York City, he talks a lot about knowing culture's defeater beliefs. What that means is our culture has certain beliefs that if you believe those things, you can't believe in Christianity. Okay, that's kind of how it goes. So some defeater beliefs I'm sure you'll be familiar with. The triumph of science or naturalism. You know, it's disproved Christianity. Christianity is negatively restricting. It restricts our freedoms. Christianity is unreasonable. The Bible's unreliable. The God of the Old Testament is a moral monster. The problem of pain and suffering is predominantly a Christian problem. And maybe the biggest one of all, who are you to say Christ is the way, the truth, and the life? The exclusivity problem. And so when you're know how to answer each of these defeater beliefs. Do you have a good answer for them? If you're able to speak to them, you're able to navigate conversation in a way that will open up a lot of doors. So for instance, with exclusivity, don't just try to argue that exclusivity is something that nearly everybody holds in their beliefs. Don't just do that, but understand why we value inclusivity as a culture. Do you have a reason from Christian faith why you value diversity or how you value unity in difference? So you should be able to speak to it proactively in terms of why we do value inclusivity. There are good reasons for inclusivity, properly understood. So be able to speak to those as well. Lastly, for speaking to a secular audience, and this is really important, I think, in terms of developing the conversation, know where and how Christianity converges with cultural beliefs or cultural media. You know, for me, this is film. But acknowledge instances of overlap due to common grace, God's common grace to everyone. So you may agree with your secular audience that something is horrifying and deeply immoral. You may agree with your secular audience that something is true, beautiful, or good. Acknowledge those agreements. And when you do acknowledge those agreements, you'll find that you might have opportunity then to talk about the inconsistencies in the foundational beliefs for those things. So if you both agree something is true, do your beliefs make sense of that being true? Or do mine make more sense of them being true? Do that generously, but it's a legitimate question to ask then if you have agreement on a particular issue. It's a good inroad. And it's just a bridge building that you genuinely care about other people. It's a good way of bridge building. Okay, my fifth point, last point. Why it is I think 3 and 4, Christian audience, secular audience, actually overlap in interesting ways. To put it particularly, I think to some degree, we're all affected by secularity. It's the culture we've grown up in. It's the culture we inhabit. So often our churches have failed to be a place of respite from the spirit of our age. We've been affected by it too. And we're affected by its plausibility structures. Sometimes we struggle. Is Christianity really true? In a way that maybe other cultures didn't. And so oftentimes the audiences converge in that way because we share the same culture. Another thing is that, to put it more theologically, we're all commonly beset by the same sins, right? And we all commonly experience an economy of common grace, which in some ways is unique to the culture we share. Christ and pop culture, how am I doing on time? Good? Okay. Christ and pop culture, I'm getting to the end here. Stick with me. Christ and pop culture, who I've been writing for, though missionally writing for a Christian audience from an evangelical perspective, has been read and promoted by the senior editor of RogerEbert.com, by the president of the Southern Baptist Convention, by the lead film critic of the Catholic Register, by the Gospel Coalition, by Rachel Held Evans, by Andrew Sullivan. If you know any of those names, you'll know what I'm saying is conservative, liberal, Christian, not. Even though we have a distinct audience and a distinct purpose, it's reached a larger audience. So that's been really, I don't know, it's been great. It's been really interesting to see that happen. I think part of it is, first, you need to know we're really going against the grain. I'll be honest with you, I don't make anything writing for Christ and pop culture. But I've loved it. It's a labor of love for all of us. None of us do. The editors don't either. It's hard to sell the sort of nuance that we're going for, to be perfectly honest. But we're getting there. I don't know. Christ pop culture could continue to grow, I think. But I think one thing we've been successful at, and we're not the only ones, lots of websites and magazines are doing this also, but we've been successful at having readers coming from divergent perspectives respect us because we approach our disagreements with humility, I think. That we really emphasize that in our writers group. Approaching our disagreements with humility, seeking to understand those who disagree with us really well. And so we've written in such a way that we take a stand. You know, we're not afraid to take a stand on a particular issue, but we try to do it humbly and in such a way that doesn't shut down the conversation immediately to those who disagree with us. I'm sure the people I named have read an article from us that they really disagreed with, but they came back and read us again. And I think that's telling. Last thing with this particular issue, George Steiner, famous literary critic, has a book called Real Presences. I want to read it. It's the opening passage of his book. It's basically the thesis of his book. He says this: "We speak still of sunrise and sunset. We do so as if the Copernican model or of the solar system had not replaced ineradicably the Ptolemaic. Vacant metaphors, eroded figures of speech, inhabit our vocabulary and grammar. They are caught tenaciously in the scaffolding and recesses of our common parlance. There they rattle about like old rags or ghosts in the attic. This is the reason why rational men and women, particularly in the scientific and technological realities of the West, still refer to God. This is why the postulate of the existence of God persists in so many unconsidered turns of phrase and allusion. No plausible reflection or belief underwrites his presence, nor does any intelligible evidence. Where God clings to our culture, to our routines of discourse, he is a phantom of grammar, a fossil embedded in the childhood of rational speech. So, Nietzsche and many after him. This essay argues the reverse. It proposes that any coherent understanding of what language is and how language performs, any coherent account of the capacity of human speech to communicate meaning and feeling is, in the final analysis, underwritten by the assumption of God's presence." Here's the big takeaway from George Steiner. You notice he mentioned the technological West, which is where we live. And I'm coming at this as a Christian who only recently understood Christianity as not these abstract set of terms up here that I need to intellectually assent to, but as something that invaded every aspect of my life and everyone else's life in all corners of the earth. And so we used, my big point here is, it sounds simple, but I think this is necessary and powerful. People, this isn't a pat on the back moment, but when anybody says, oh, you know, that article is really insightful, I think one of the things that I do, and I'll share my secret, is explain what words mean. Explain what words mean. So, forgiveness, grace, mercy, community, love, freedom. These are words everybody uses in our culture. And we know what they mean, but we don't know how they're meaningful. So, you have a context as a Christian to explain the meaningfulness of meaning. You have a context to connect, give connective tissue to what words mean. And so in my column, oftentimes, you know, forgiveness happens in a particular movie, right? I'll just have a line where I say, to forgive is to, and I'll give a gloss on what forgiveness means. I'm probably not even going to reference the Bible in that particular sentence. I'm just going to explain what it means. A Bible verse hasn't taken it the whole way for some Christians, although it should. And so I think this applies to Christians, unbelievers. Explain what words mean. To conclude, I think we're all familiar with the New Testament writers having a particular audience. We often talk about the gospel writers, how the accounts differ based on the audience that they're writing for. If you look at Jesus, you know, the way he handles audiences is very different depending on who his audience is. And he knows each of his audience members intimately. He knows their needs, and he cares deeply about them. And so I would challenge you to do the same. I'm going to conclude with this. It's a quote from F.L. Lucas, his book, Style, The Art of Writing Well. It's a short passage. If I can find it. I had it marked, I promise. Okay, here we go. He says, style is a means by which a human being gains contact with others. It is personality clothed in words, character embodied in speech. If handwriting reveals character, style reveals it still more, unless it is so colorless and lifeless as not really to be a style at all. Therefore, if you wish your writing to seem good, your character must seem at least partly so. And since in the long run deception is likely to be found out, your character had better not only seem good, but be it. Those who publish make themselves public in more ways than they sometimes realize. Authors may sell their books, but they give themselves away. So I conclude with this. If you want to write, be aware that you are giving of yourself, and what you write ought to be a gift to your audience and to your readers. So I would ask you to think, what kind of character do you have? Do you have something worth giving? Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to steal it because I've got a microphone. I'm going to ask the first question. When I was in school, apologetics was often taught in ways of like argument, counter-argument.
Yeah.
Basically, if you think what you say is an apologetic, would you say that style then would be a type of apologetic that might be in contrast to that kind of thing?
Yeah, if an apologetic if we just take it to mean a defense of what you believe or defense of Christianity specifically to us, I think style is important because people will only receive what you say if how you say it comports with what you believe. So what I mean by that is, as a Christian, you don't just have a responsibility to what you say, you have a responsibility to how you say it. And that is a great, and I mentioned this in the presentation, but Christ Pop culture, I think that's what we do well, is we really, most of our conversations in the writers group have to do with making sure that we are handling potential disagreements really well in our writing, and that we are approaching those who disagree with us really graciously and humbly. And I think that has been one thing that has really spoken well for us as a website is people really respond well to that. Yeah.
I'm sort of wanting to possibly write in the future alongside of fiction. I'm curious, you mentioned about actually getting in a writing community. Mm-hmm. When it comes to actually seeking an audience like that, what if you're already involved with quite a bit of other things? How might you find the time, or what might actually help when you actually maybe end up being short on time in the future?
In order to, have time to do what? Sorry.
It's because I'm already involved in a lot of other things too, and like finding time to actually
to actually
get in a group
to be part of a writer's community,
something like that. To actually like find an audience, actually help
to
see what the audience is looking for out of that.
Too busy to be part of a group.
Okay. I don't know. Do you have anything? Can either of you speak to that?
I think you have to prioritize. I think being part of a writing community is really important. Mm-hmm. But with that said, since I'm a professor and I'm assuming you're a student, I would say while you're a student, please don't prioritize that over other things, because you have time periods in your life when you're doing certain things, but when you're free from those things, then you would need to make that a priority if you're serious about it, because writing communities are really, really important, unless you're just writing in your journal.
Yeah. Well, the other thing, I mean, just a simple answer maybe, but read books. You know, that's in a sense its own community because you're being influenced by other writers. So read good books. That's kind of its own writer's community in a way.
I'm not familiar with your website, but here's a question for you.
Sure.
It seems like a lot of the Christian blogs and things like that kind of take the Fox News approach. And so picking a film here, like The End of the Spear, there was a controversy about using a gay actor to play the missionary there. How did your website handle that? Maybe you weren't with them at that point or something like that, but I wondered, you know, okay, so we take on this issue and you've got Christians fighting against Christians, and we're kind of doing it out there for the world, and really let's talk about the values of the film and how, well, you know, there's a tremendous line in there, well, no, I'm not going to fight back, you know, they don't know Jesus and that, and so it was a tremendous film, but it kind of got overshadowed by that controversy.
Yeah, and the funny thing about that is that's a Christian movie. Imagine some of the responses we received for not Christian movies, or at least not explicitly Christian movies. Yeah, I think our approach has been, you know, with any of those sorts of things, a lot of Christians get caught up in, oh, Hollywood is so liberal. And look, in many ways, yeah, Hollywood is liberal. You know, it kind of comes with the territory. We just don't address those issues. We kind of ignore them. That's our basic approach. I focus in my column on the movie itself. I assess the movie, and you know, my stuff about secular audience really applies to film because films that come out of Hollywood or around the world are made for human beings generally. They're made for a pluralistic audience. So what that means, so part of my work, what I try to do is I talk about that convergence issue that I mentioned. I point out things that are great in the movie, that are good, that are true, that are beautiful. I point out inconsistencies in the movie, maybe, things I disagree with. So, but just as far as these side issues that a lot of Christians get caught up with, I don't mean to demean that. I'm sure there's some good purpose, probably not with that one, because picking with The End of the Spear just seems, I don't know, I hadn't heard that. But we kind of ignore that talk and keep on our straight and narrow with what our mission is.
Anything else?
Yeah. That being in mind, what would you say your target audience is with Christ in pop culture?
Yeah, I mentioned this. It's a bit of a tricky thing. I would say that if you look at our mission statement, our target audience is the church. It's Christians. And we don't really get too much into demographics, but because it's pop culture, it tends to be a certain age group, younger age group, typically. And probably evangelicals. I don't know for sure, but just because we're coming from a more evangelical perspective. But like I said, I think one thing that we have done purposefully is we've said we also want it to be accessible to everybody else. And if you're writing as a Christian, it ought to be. I mean, you know, so we try to write, even if we're writing about a theological issue, we try to do so in a way that we realize everybody else is listening to. So it ends up being broad, even though we have a specific target.